Good morning. So this is a recap and reflections as the GM of our Symbaroum campaigns. Um, this is a GM rotation project. So I GM a session, Dell GMs a session, David GMs a session. This happened to be a part 2 of session 11. David's had, I think, a couple of part 2s. Dell's had, I think, a part 2. A 2-session rotation. And this happened to be something we needed to resolve, so it was a second session. The difference between the last this session 11 part 1 and part 2 is I was strictly adhering to the setting and adventures book 2 of the starter box, which is wilderness hex crawl. It has wilderness hex crawl rules, right? You proceed into the Davakar daily. You make the guide, generally an NPC, a hired. If one of the PCs doesn't have the bushcraft of appropriate level, then you need a guide who can orient your group as you traverse, looking for ruins and of course dealing with threats. And because the Davakar is indeed, it's not so much an exploration of what might be out there as it is a knowing, a willing excursion into a very dangerous and hostile world. So it's not as if you're going in to find out, what's out there. Everything you run into is for the most part going to be hostile and dangerous. You're looking for ruins to excavate treasure and of course get back to earn your keep, so to speak, or whatever else may come up as far as, game goals or party goals. You're trying to help the queen eradicate the Iron Pact or something. There can be an overarching kind of idea. But anyway, so this was our first hex crawl that adhered strictly to these rules, really, but I did my own personal creature charts, and I'll show what those. I think they're actually written in here. So the first session, I had different charts from 1 to 21 plus are in this book, but I customized the charts in session 1, and I customized for session 2 a different group of monsters, or a different probability of certain types of creatures occurring. And then, of course, for my, because this is a hex crawl, there's no pre-written material. I mean, this is it, right? The ruins chart is directly from the book. So I didn't write my own ruins charts. The descriptions and the idea of how much treasure could be there and their excavation options. There's nothing wrong with that in the starter box. I'm going to leave that for now. I mean, if I was going to run a campaign long-term like this, I would want my own ruins charts, right? My own descriptions, my own ideas of what's there, etc. I might put in a predetermined number of treasures that can be found, okay, as opposed to a random D-roll for treasures that could possibly be found. But again, it's a whole different thing. But I did randomize the misfortune chart, 1d10 misfortune chart for both sessions, and I did randomize the enemies charts for both sessions. So that's where we picked up last night. So different mishaps chart, and with my own types of mishaps and how they could affect play. Pretty fun. So first of all, Dell's character had died at the end of the last part 1. Thariah. Dell yesterday afternoon wrote and said, there's in the advanced player's handbook, there are rules to play an undead creature. Would you be okay if I played Thariah as an undead creature? And there could be a reason for that. That would be accounted for based on the logic of the interlude descriptions of what happened to Thariah in a ritual and his being held 72 hours by authorities to determine whether he was part of the threat of those rituals. Dell said, could we just assume that at some point during those rituals, or even while he was being held, that that somehow he was affected or cursed by maybe purposely in these rituals? To some degree, we didn't discuss the great details of that. Just it was a hint that could his character become undead and he could play it. And I said, absolutely, why not? So the conversation then was, well, how do we go about doing that? I said, we just play. You're still Thariah as your character. It's just now you're undead. And I started the session describing how he wakes up in the dark, and he may or may not recollect who he is and how he got there, but that's up to him. He stumbles out of the cave, and I'm so proud of the players. We just played. We just did what you would have done in when we were kids. You play your character. They discover these truths or facts as they figure them out, either as as an actual player or via mechanics. And I was just that's just how I believe we play. You play your character, and things occur in play genuinely, authentically based on characters and the player's willingness. So Dell describes how he stumbles out of the caves. I then both Cabello, Todd, and David are then prompted. There's Thariah, who you both had believed was dead. Matter of fact, you can't believe he's not dead. But they have to actually discover it either through investigation or through actual dice checks. The rules state they may not recognize he's undead until there's a particular event or something. So, of course, there were a couple of checks to see if they recognized that he was actually not alive, that he was a walking incarnation of Thariah as an undead creature. And again, I was just so happy that we played it, right? We just played it. We played characters. We conducted the game. Dell is a character. He just happens to be an undead. He just happens to be his character, but he's now undead. And both Cabello, who's freaked out by it for a couple of reasons. One, he's like, holy, this thing is Walking Dead. But also, he feels a little bit of remorse that he might have abandoned him, and he might, that would be a bit awkward for Cabello to have to, at some point, discuss with Thariah why he abandoned him there and escaped the spiders. So Cabello is definitely freaked out by Thariah stumbling out of the caves. Malleus, of course, wakes at the camp. The boy Bonner is resting peacefully, but he is not awake yet, as he had a major head injury and was sleeping. Malleus recognizes Thariah, but it takes him a little longer to recognize that he is suffering. He has suffered wounds. He is definitely not just injured, right? Dell describes that Thariah goes for the boy Bonner, again, not in a negative way, but just in a kind of a curiosity way. He's trying to recollect who he is and who are these people, and something about the boy reminds him. So he goes toward the boy, though. And by the way, remember, he raised this boy as his apprentice. At who knows what age that he would have acquired this child. But so it's almost like his son. And Malleus, his reaction is to put Thariah out of his misery, and certainly before he touches the boy, as he is stricken with a jolt of cold when he places his sword upon Thariah's chest to kind of stop him from wandering forward, and he feels this icy cold effect, which affected a temporary corruption check for both Malleus and Cabello, as Cabello physically touched him to push him away from the boy. So they actually suffered some temporary corruption. If they failed the resolution check, they both failed, so they both suffered some temporary corruption. As Thariah is almost 100% corruption as an undead creature with this cold effect. But Malleus won't let him touch the boy, and he has to make not a hit roll because there was no defense. Thariah was completely occupied with touching the boy. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't moving in particular speed. So I just asked, the only thing David's character had to do was be strong enough to cut his head off in a clean shot. If he had failed that, Thariah would have taken damage, but Thariah would have been walking around with his head half cut off, which would have been, of course, more terrifying for the boy to see his master / surrogate father be chopped down. Fortunately, David made the strength check and was able to lop his head off in one blow. They removed the body. Cabello started to pack up the camp as Malleus and Bonner burned Thariah's body to make sure there would be no more resurrection of this body. And they decided, Cabello advised for the most part, and Malleus and Bonner were in a complete agreement. We should turn around now, 2 days into this place. We aren't equipped. We don't have the tools or the personnel or the services available to us to stay healthy on an 8 to 10 day journey through the Davakar to get to a town called Malima. So Cabello basically puts his foot down and says, I think before we get too far, we should turn around now and head back. We're roughly a day and a half hike back to the Ambrian staging area at the edge of the Bright Davakar, and then we're just 400 yards away from the town of Thistlehold. Let's go back. And Malleus is in firm agreement, and Bonner, of course, the young boy, doesn't really argue yes or no either way. So Cabello now has to orient and get them safely back on track to find their way out of the Davakar, as opposed to getting lost or going the wrong direction. And unfortunately, he fails for the first time in our hex crawling. He fails his first bushcraft check. And that meant he had to make a misfortune, 1 die 10 random misfortune roll to see what misfortune befalls the group as they wander through the Davakar. That does not preclude the normal enemies roll they must make daily and the normal ruins roll they must make daily. So, of course, I asked Dale, make your ruins roll. And I asked Malleus, based on Cabello's failed bushcraft roll, to make a monsters check. So I had a monster number on the tables randomly, and I had a ruins number on the tables randomly. But he also rolled a misfortune one, which is dense fog, which affects their ability to orient on every occasion if they do anything. But it also requires a reroll of a second enemy's roll with a +2. So this became the trump to his first daily enemies roll. Okay. This would be a part of the fog as opposed to the other enemies roll, which could have showed up if they continued marching on. Those enemies could have showed up at camp or something. But this happened to be the enemies roll with a +2 on the table that might arise inside this dense fog, this blighted fog. It's basically it's not just fog, it's a corrupt fog, right? So Symbaroum has corruption. Corruption creates blighted. There can be blighted ground, there can be blighted creatures, there can be blighted humans. So think creatures and humans that are so corrupt, they are blighted, they are sick, they are corrupted. Well, I created a blighted fog, basically, effect, but it's described as a dense fog, and it's the densest fog there. I mean, it's definitely not natural fog. I mean, this is a otherworldly blighted fog. And David rolled a 19 +2 is 21. And again, the goal of this particular session was to get to Malima, investigate the town of Malima to discover where they could find the target. They had a Chamberlain had given them a target, an elf, a summer elf who was part of the Iron Pact, who had conspired to have the queen assassinated by blackmailing the Chamberlain, in which he murdered his son and daughter and took his grandkids hostage. And the Chamberlain discovered rumors of where he was at and told them, go find him, go kill him. I want him dead. So they took on that job. Well, that's an 8-day journey into the Davakar. But I had put on both charts, there was one of the enemy's table rolls could be that they actually stumble across that target in Yondo, hunting in the Davakar, doing what the Iron Pact does, traveling to the Davakar and stopping humans from raping the Davakar of its treasures and its ruins and its sacred artifacts. And indeed, he rolled a 19 +2 was the dense fog, 21, and 21 on my chart. The highest possible roll was in Yondo with his 2 pet jackars, which are battle-trained wolf dogs. They're like, think of 4-legged wolf / dogs. He has them on a leash, and he's out hunting by himself with these 2 dogs. So they stumble into this dense fog. The fog is designed to isolate the characters. So I create the fog to do 2 things. One, disorient the characters with constant vigilant checks just to know which direction, if they're hearing properly. So it really discombobulates them, not just visually, but in many other ways. It's corruption blighted fog. So they have to roll to know what direction something comes from. If they move through the fog, they don't necessarily know where they're going. They have to make vigilance checks constantly to hear properly, to make out things. And it's designed, I designed that particular mishap to isolate characters from each other. making anything they might run into in the dense blighted fog far more dangerous, as they could not as a party necessarily engage multiple creatures, and they might be engaged in separate places by multiple creatures, which makes it's an effect upon potential encounters with monsters. Okay. Their vigilant checks, good or bad, would determine whether the creature that was in the fog would actually find them as well. So one, if they succeeded the vigilance rolls, they can find the creature, or they can find what they're looking for, or what they're listening for. But if they fail those vigilance checks, that can also determine whether the creatures find them. And once they fail a vigilance roll and the creatures find them, the creature, being certainly a jacker, a dog, an ability to smell, and etc., would basically be able to maintain contact in melee with them. So this, I knew immediately when I rolled 21 with the Jackar and the Summer Elf in Yondo, was going to be incredibly dangerous. If they just ran into him in the woods, it was going to be a potentially epic fight with them able to coordinate. The dense fog basically meant they could not coordinate. There was no way that Cabello could coordinate what was happening to Malleus, and he'd have to make a roll to even find Malleus in the fog, and etc. I had pre-written tactics for Nyando. If in the hex crawl they found him, he would attempt to make sure he isolated the weakest person and take them out one at a time, allowing his Jackars to corral the other groups of the party. So I stuck with those tactics in the fog, and I described why it took the Summer Elf so many rounds for Summer Elf to get involved in the combat. Was he was trying to isolate Bonner from the group, and then Dell stumbles right into that by using one of his traits for Bonner, where he can kind of make himself very difficult to follow and watch, almost invisible against one target, and he wanted to do that and then stumble off into the fog away from the combat, which would have been great had he succeeded the roll. He would have actually disappeared into the fog, losing the Summer Elf, who was trying to work Bonner away from Malleus. So he and Malleus were together almost back to back in the fog, but he wanted to get him away. Well, Dell failed that roll as he ran off into the fog, and I just described in failure, you ran smack into the chest of this Summer Elf, who basically then said, "I'm going to kill you first." While his dogs were fighting Cabello, his jackers, his battle-trained jackers were fighting Cabello and Malleus in their own pockets in the fog. Dell ends up conjuring, praying to Prios for the guardian saint, and it manifests itself to protect the boy and strikes the elf. The elf manages, unfortunately, was unable to do damage to Bonner. Bonner suffering already damage from the head wound he got in the day before, 2 days before. Malleus was struggling mightily with one of these Jackars in a fight in the fog, and Cabello was slowly doing damage to the creature that was attacking him. However, Cabello wasn't doing a ton of damage to that particular Jackar. Ultimately, Cabello, Malleus finally kills the Jackar that he's dealing with. And I think Malleus at this point might have been down to 4 or 5 toughness left. I mean, he took a couple of shots. I wouldn't be surprised if Malleus was down to about 3 points. Again, I trust them to track their toughness. I don't necessarily track their scores. I trust them to tell me when they hit 0 or whatever. I know their pain threshold because I know their general toughness. So I know roughly what their pain threshold is. So I know if they've been potentially knocked down or not, but I'm not necessarily tracking their hit points. I track, of course, the creatures, but I'm not, these guys are if they hit 0, they're gonna tell me they're down, right? Okay. Meanwhile, Malleus, thanks to this holy manifestation of a guardian that is imbued with the light of Prios, the god, it burns away this corrupted fog, making it easier for Malleus to see Bonner and the Summer Elf. So Malleus doesn't have to he doesn't have to orient and bind Bonner in the fog fighting. So he goes right to him, and and Cabello as well can see as this. So in a way, the manifestation of this guardian creature did more to burn away the fog for him than it actually did much damage. But very cool, because this thing was a manifestation of Prios, therefore an exact thwarting of corruption. And again, this was a blighted fog, so it was just fantastic play to find out. And it's just so amazing how when all this stuff comes together, how it creates these scenarios, these moments, these things. It's so cool. And they end up, Cabello ends up hammering this elf, knocking him off his feet. Malleus finishes by driving his weapons into the as the elf is trying to crawl away. He is down to 1 point. So I surrender. The elf surrenders. He rolls over on his back, holding his wounds in his side, and he surrenders. He basically says, "You must let me go," which is asinine, as this thing was going to kill them. And they have a hatred for the humans, right? Again, but their hatred is justified in that they believe that the humans have broken the Iron Pact, right? They believe that the queen and the usurpers into this world, into this northern lands, are you know, even the barbarians aren't real happy about the Ambrians' exploration and taking of treasures and relics. But the barbarians, for the most part, are fairly neutral in civilization. In the Davokar, every barbarian clan would feel a little differently about running into treasure hunters, so to speak. Okay. Long story short, they discover Inyando says, "You must let me go. I am Inyando." And I thought they would all recognize the name immediately, but I think it took them a second to register. Inyando is actually who they're looking for. But they do figure it out. And Malleus attempts to solicit some information from Inyando, but he is not going to cooperate. He is, at that point, when he realizes they won't let him go, he basically tells them, "Then kill me. I won't succumb to your I'd rather die than succumb to your prodding or your questions or your whatever." And of course, their job was to find him and to dispatch him. So Malleus reluctantly does what he feels he must do to complete the contract. They then collect from him some artifacts, a medallion that hangs from his neck, a ring that he wears on his right index finger, hoping that one or both of these items could identify him as Inyando, so they could send word or evidence to the Chamberlain and Indaros that they did indeed succeed at doing this job well done, so to speak. But they're not yet certain whether this will help them. But they at least get these treasures from Inyando's body. They were able to then and because they're only so they remember both these sessions were just 2 days in. They got into the Davokar day 1. Day 2, they ran into the bridge. And day 3, they were in the ravine and found the cave in the first session. So they're really 2 days march away from the staging area to get out of the Davokar safely. And they've already gone a day when they hit this fog. So they're really 1 more day's travel successfully to get to the staging area and out of the Davokar. So the great thing about turning around was they were only 2 bushcraft daily checks away from getting away. So we were getting close to the time limit that we put on these sessions to make sure everybody can get to bed on time for their next day lives, right? Their careers, their jobs, their families, their whatever. And so we were closing in, and I said, we just need to make 1 more orientation check, Cabello, and then we'll narrate the interlude of whether you get, how you get out. So his role just successfully would not have made me roll another mishap table. It would not have made me, at this point, because we were narrating getting home. So I wasn't going to then interrupt that and create a whole nother scenario that might take another session. But I made up my mind that depending on if he passed or failed that, it would just inform how I was going to write. I was going to narrate the interlude as to whether they got home safely or whether they spent 2 days lost in the woods and it was, scary. It was just going to inform how I narrated them getting back to the staging area of the edge of the Davokar. They then traversed the Thistlehold, and at the gates of Thistlehold, you are inspected. You were asked to declare any of the treasures and any of the herbs and any things you've taken out of the Davokar. They expect you to voluntarily share that, especially if you've already paid for the right to bring things out. It's already paid for, right? The taxes on those things were paid for by getting a license. So they just expect people who have the license to adhere to this tracking of treasures that come out of the Davokar, the administrative tracking by the Queen's legation of what's coming out of the Davokar. Well, this group has no legal right to be in the Davokar. Thariah was the only character that went into the Davokar. Bonner and Thariah were the only ones that could have had a legal right to actually bring out treasures, herbs, wood, whatever they bring out. They have to have they have to pay for the right to do that. Okay. Recognizing they don't have the license to do it, they decided they would tell the tax man, so to speak, of the Queen's legation at the gate that they don't have anything and that they would hide whatever they had. David says he wears the ring like it's his. He puts the medallion on, but he unfortunately puts it on kind of backwards. Cabello successfully hides the gold needles from the pincushion doll in his hair. They don't discover that. They do see the doll and the boxes. They presented that without question. They're fined for that. They don't know the gold needles, but they fine them for not declaring this. And then of course they didn't because they didn't have a license. They just have to pay fines. So buying the license allows them to bring back as much treasure and as much stuff as they want without fines, right? Without or other punishments. So they had to pay some fines on as David has discovered he has these two items. They don't take them, they don't confiscate them, but they fine them, they tax them for them, which is going to be more expensive in the long run than if you just paid for a license, right? Okay. This is how they control what's coming and going out of civilization. That's not to say somebody couldn't come out of the Davokar tree line and hike onto Yindarus or hike onto another town in the world. But to come into Thistlehold where you're going to transact and you're going to sell these items or you're going to whatever, obviously they're going to try to control that and make as much tax or revenue on it as they can. And they were obviously coming home to Thistlehold, so they clearly had to go through this checkpoint. Okay. So long story short, we then quickly narrate an interlude to get to the scene where Cabello fences his golden needles and gets 20 thaler for those golden needles. And we then interlude to a scene in which David is paying a specialist to identify this ring and this medallion. He learns the medallion is ancient Symbaroum text, not Elven text on the medallion. He cannot translate it. He suggests they go to Yindarus to find a scholar who could translate the medallion. But he does pull down a book of families, a book. Think of a family tree book that you might find in, say, Britain, right? Where the Brits like to, there's a books. You could open them up and look up the family of Archibald and see who they're related to, right? But this happens to be a book on elven family legacy. And the ring would be the crest as opposed to a shield, a crest for a knight, or if a family crest, they use rings or jewelry, whatever, right? In my version of these elves, my summer elves, my elves, and the ring itself identified in the book the Inyondo family, and so they knew they had evidence that they found Inyondo, and again, these elves in my world go by family names. And so they know they got Inyondo. So now they have the ring as evidence to the Chamberlain that they successfully completed the request by the Chamberlain. So that's it. We wrapped it up there. They ended up paying a few thalers fines. They ended up paying a thaler to have the artifacts identified. But for the most part, they come away with, I think, 30. They had 18 thalers in their pockets. They came away with another 20 thalers. So they have like 35 thalers to their name, which is very good. And they're doing pretty darn good right now, right? They've been successful. Again, I think Malleus took a beating. Cabello had a couple of injuries. Bonner had a pretty serious head injury, taking 4 of his 12 toughness that had not yet been recovered. They had no way to recover toughness other than a full day's rest. They were not able to ever get a complete day's rest because they could not calm Bonner with simple rolls to calm him so he could sleep through a night and they could get some rest. So none of them ever had a chance to heal on this journey. They did not have any herbal remedies. They did not have any anybody there capable of conducting healing rituals. So they were lucky, to be honest. The things that not more than Thariah was unfortunately killed in the was killed in the first session. Because Thariah was a character, again, I have to play that game as player versus player, so I have to ask Dell, how he wants to defend himself. I have to ask Dell, are you okay with this? What is it? Do you want to defend yourself in this? Do you want to allow this to happen? Or it would become, in a way, a PvP, right? Could potentially become a fight between the two players. I don't mean players, the characters. It could become a fight where Thariah, as an undead creature, who attempts to defend himself against. So, we're playing with players. These are their characters. I have to ask those questions, as opposed to making assumptions. That David just kills Thariah, or that Thariah would suddenly. I'm not going to take control of Thariah and fight against David and Todd's characters. And again, we are veterans, we're mature, and we understand. And I'm so happy that they genuinely played out this very complicated situation, right? Because I have never been one to take control of people's characters, and I've always had games that ask me to. Genuinely, even in old D&D, I don't like spells, for instance, that give players control over other players, and our player characters control over other characters. I don't like taking control of player characters. So I either avoid those circumstances through tweaks, homebrew tweaks, etc., or we have to trust the player to play genuinely that your character's gone insane. What is your character doing? And hopefully they will adjudicate self-control to describe how their character loses his noggin for a minute and a half, and how his character runs off into the woods, or how his character. So I trust players to not relinquish any control or agency over their character, but to play honestly what this effect is upon their character, whether it's a dice roll of stress, or a table that says you're panicked, or a table that says you've lost your mind, or a table that says you're confused. Just don't meta it. Don't avoid that your character's confused and meta past it, or don't meta the game. Genuinely, make decisions if your character's blind or confused, etc. So it went great, fantastic. And again, I didn't know. Dell was literally going, "Do you think they'll kill him? What do you think they'll do?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean him? I'm going to introduce you in session immediately, describing to you as Thariah what's happening to you around you, and you're going to play Thariah. I'm not going to introduce Thariah as an undead creature. It'd be pointless. It is your character. You need to play your character, and they'll decide whether they're okay with it, or they'll decide whether this fits." And of course, David, a tough decision for these guys, right? They're technically facing Dale's character, Thariah, but they can see the corruption and the fact that he's undead, and they're going to put him out of his misery, and they're going to save themselves and the boy from any potential corruption and threat. So they arrived at those decisions based on the integrity of how we've been playing our characters for the last 10 sessions, 11 sessions. So that was the other thing I liked. Taro, I would have been the same. Taro would have said no. I mean, we're spending our days and our nights fighting against these evil things. We're spending our days and our nights facing this stuff that is difficult and terrifying. And there's no way we're going to suddenly befriend one, right? This isn't Hollywood, right? This isn't a cute D&D 5th edition session where one guy's playing a ghost and one guy's, that's not what this game's about. Now, as I said, this could have been a Symbaroum party from the get-go that had an undead in it. This group would have had a different attitude about corruption and about what's going on. That would have been different. But I was proud to see both Cabello and Malleus stick with the integrity of what our characters have been facing and what we've been about from day one. And therefore, Thariah, to them, is dead. And they got to put him out of his misery. And they have to protect themselves and the boy from any ill effects of even hanging around with this corrupted creature. So it's very cool. And then, of course, we had Bonner, and Bonner already has 20 XP as an NPC. And so instantly, Dell just slides into the shoes of Bonner, and instantly Dell is capable of spending that 20 XP to give this boy a archetype, or pick some rituals or whatever it is. And so he's going to show up, and he ends up with this guardian ritual where he can call upon Prios, and this saint guardian will protect him and do damage and etc. And then the other is this kind of turning himself, making himself obscured from perception of a particular target, in a sense, going invisible. So very cool. We now have this boy Bonner who's come of age, right? We're finding out that he had some talents and some things he learned along his trek, maybe with Thoraya, that he just hasn't been able to practice because Thoraya might not have recognized it, or Thoraya might not have allowed it, or Thoraya might have been against it, right? So we're finding out this boy's, in his 17 years, has learned a few things, right? And it turns out he is now liberated from Thoraya, and the boy can now practice what he believes. Fantastic. I'm thrilled in a way that Dell wasn't playing an undead, because I do believe his role play would have been limited. I mean, I think it would have been a very oppressive role play for him as an undead creature. Even in society, they go back to Thistlehold. There's no way they're going to allow an undead creature to walk through the doors of Thistlehold. Anyone and everyone probably would have wanted him dead, and the authorities probably would have wanted him dead. That would have been the end. I mean, it would have been very, very. It would have restricted Dell's participation in civilized world, and I think it would have restricted his role play, right? But the boy Bonner now can be dynamic and diverse and become or be all kinds of interesting personality, right? But I think Thoraya would have been very limiting ultimately if the guys had said, "Oh, okay, have a seat, Thoraya. Do you want breakfast?" It could have worked, but I think it would have been an interesting dynamic, which could have been fun to see. But I think it would have been ultimately very limiting for Dell, both in participation once they arrive at civilization. Imagine running into a group of barbarians in the Davokar. They're not going to look on the Draggle, right? I mean, they absolutely despise the Draggle. The barbarians are terrified of the Draggle, which are undead. They believe the Ambrians have brought this taint to them, right? The elves. So undead is definitely frowned upon. There would be a handful of cultures that would have been embraced the undead. So it's kind of fascinating. But it was very cool of Dell to say, "Can I try it?" But hell yes, of course you can. If it's in the rules, I'll do it. I'm not going to just let you make yourself stay alive as an undead character. But if it's in the rules that you can be ultimately resurrected or play an undead, and there's rules that inform us as to how that undead thing's going to work in game, both mechanically and narratively, then I have no problem with it. And it was great. It turned out to be a great session. What's amazing again is that really almost the whole session came down to them trying to determine how they wanted to deal with this undead creature that was stumbling around their camp, and then the complication of the misfortune roll of the blighted fog, the corrupt fog, with the enemy roll modified to the 21, which is a very dangerous trio of enemies, the summer elf in Yondo and his two jackars, which are wolves. They're basically wolf type creatures. In this complication of the dense fog, the blighted fog, it ended up eating up the entire session. So this whole session was basically, for the most part, a combat on their trek back toward Thistlehold. And I'm okay with that. I mean, it was it just took that long. It took that long for them to fight off these creatures. It took that long for them to, resolve the battle. And again, none of this stuff is pre-designed. None of this stuff's pre-written. You don't know if you're going to end up traveling 8 days in one session. You don't know if you're going to end up in a ruin. You spend the whole session investigating a ruin and digging up treasure. You just don't know. But that's what makes this joyful. It's what makes it fun. And that's what makes this particular style of gaming, whether it's old school D&D, whether it's an OSR, whether it is Symbaroum, D&D 5th edition, however you're doing a hex crawl where you randomly generate in a way what's in front of them. It makes for great fun for me because I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm having now it becomes, there's moments where it's clearly very administrative. I have to stop and flip open the book because it says Meerkats, page 219, and I got to look up Meerkats, and or they roll a ruin, and I got to look up and read the ruin. And so stuff's not pre-written. I haven't committed any pre-designed ideas to my head that on day 2 they're going to encounter this ruin that has witches in it. That's which is fine. That works. It's great. That's how Symbaroum's core rulebook implies that you're going to play pre-written adventures, right? They're going to stumble on the third day through the Davokars. I described this amazing trek through the Davokar. They're going to find this ruin, and this ruin is going to have in it this thing, which is what I did in session 1 of our campaigns. I used a modified hex rule to get them to my pre-designed location, but then everything that happened was designed. I designed the serpent on the tower. I designed the elves that were hiding they were trapped in the tower because they couldn't get away from the serpent. And were camping up there. The serpent showed up. They had been trapped in the tower. So they ended up facing the serpent. They ended up facing the 2 elves. So the first session, all of that was a pre-designed location. It was a pre-written encounter location where they could still unearth artifacts. They could still find treasure, etc. This was straight up. We roll it and we go. And I used the math from the book. So even though I had my own customized monster charts, the math was no different. So 20% chance they wouldn't encounter anything, 80% chance they're going to encounter something daily, and it's generally hostile. And that chart is going to be modified up or down based on Cabello's bushcraft rolls. And then I use the actual ruins charts, excavation charts, and treasure charts from that starter box set. Great fun. Great fun. And I did invent this dense blighted fog. That was my thing. Inyando was based on the summer elf in the book, but Inyando had his own attributes and his own abilities. The Jackars were again used from the battle trained Jackar stat block, but they were slightly adjusted. So I customized my battle trained Jackar to some degree, mostly in toughness. So I basically tweaked the toughness of the Jackars slightly. And the Summer Elf block for Inyando was a legitimate NPC, not just a monster stat block. So I made Inyando an actual character. So he had a slightly different attributes than the Summer Elf might be perceived in the core book, but not by much, just a little bit of tweaks here and there. That's it. So it was great. And I would say this, I think as a hex crawl, works beautifully. The starter box is good for learning the rules. It's good for doing this thing as starting characters. But what you're going to find very quickly with the starter box tables is they're literally only going to feature the monsters that are in that 80 or 50 page starter book. So you'll very quickly realize that all the creatures that are listed on that starter set enemies table are only what's in that thin starter set monster book. So there's a lot of creatures that make the Symbaroum an amazing place. There's a lot of creatures, NPCs, monsters, far more diverse. So you can make your own charts, adhere to the percentage of chance that they'll encounter an enemy daily, but you can really customize in the Davokar where they're at. So for instance, on my chart, the Karit barbarian clan could be encountered in multiple times because they are in the Karohar version of the Davokar, which the Karohar are the Karit barbarians who are not friendly to Ambrians. So there were 2 instances on my chart. One, they could run into a hunting party of the Karit. The other, they would run into a traveling group of Karit barbarians. Traveling group, maybe not as hostile. The hunting group of Karit barbarians would have been immediately hostile. So I had 2 instances on my charts that were customized for the area of the Karohar. I didn't customize the ruins charts. They're fine, right? Because the ruins are just going to describe something like an old bridge, a broken down old bridge with 2 towers, right? And then there's a random number for the number of potential treasures that can be found here if they decide to camp and excavate the site. If they find something, then you roll to see what they find, and then you roll to see if it's got value, right? They didn't do any real excavation on this 2 sessions. They discovered what the robbers had excavated in the pyrite fool's gold, which technically would have been a treasure there. They found that. And quickly, Thariah made sense of the fact that it was worthless. The robbers didn't know that. And Cabello as an excavation role, escaping in the dark out of the ruin, he stumbled upon the treasure box with the gold, with the pin cushion with gold needles in it. So instead of being something where he dug it up, I had him with a chance that he could stumble on something that just literally was there, and he ended up coming away with that. So it doesn't have to be they just dig and see what they find. You could present these treasures twice, because there were 6 treasures at the Elven ruins. Cabello stumbled over one. I had Bonner, when he was getting the torch ready to burn Tharia's body, made a passive vigilance check to spot a treasure in the brush. He failed that roll. Same moment in game, I had Cabello, as he packed up the camp, make a passive vigilance check to see if he spotted a potential treasure around this cave, and he failed. So both those vigilance checks weren't for creatures sneaking up on them. They weren't for traps. They were actually to spot with an opportunity to excavate a shallow potential treasure, like, spotting in the dirt. What is that? Is that a skull? And you go over and you brush it out and you find out, oh wait, no, and around that skull's neck is a medallion, and boom, they get a treasure, right? So it was just a chance for them to passively see 2 of the treasures, because there were 6 at this location. There could have been something scattered about, not necessarily in the cave, but around the cave. They failed those rolls, so they didn't get to excavate or discover the 2 potential treasures before they packed up camp and headed back. Great game, loved it. This is why we play. We play to find out. I like generating. I like playing games where I get to generate for the most part, and not completely know what's going to happen. I definitely have no problem with pre-designed challenges, pre-designed adventures, putting in front of them particular encounters, etc. But there is something just joyful about this, because you're having fun. I'm playing. I become more of a player then as a GM, not just not just a narrator, not just a guy that's presenting some pre-designed idea of what they're going to encounter that will be fun for them, right? I get to create the dense fog, the blighted fog, and how it affects play. I get to create the monster tables and enemy tables and what that might look like when they encounter it. I get to all the mishaps. I customized all my own mishaps if Cabello fails his bushcraft. So I get to create things. I just don't know what's going to happen or if it's going to happen. And there is something for me that makes it fun, because I get to be a player in a way. I get to see, wow, and I have to somehow adjudicate that in front of them, similar to what we do in our game Dark Age of Man, right? I'm naive to some degree, and it just makes it fun because we don't know where it's going to go, what it's going to do. And again, I prefer players play their characters. I prefer they play them genuinely, authentically, based on what they believe or think, and what they think their characters believe and think. Therefore, if Dell wants to play Tharia as undead, and there's rules for him to play Tharia as an undead creature, then we're gonna let him be a player character as an undead Tharia, and I'm gonna start the session describing to Tharia he wakes up in the dark, and he's a player, and the other 2 players may be scratching their head, but at least we played it by the rules. He was actually a player character, Tharia, with a new archetype, an undead archetype, versus a spell casting staff mage, right? So anything could transpire between the players, and it's played out legitimately, and of course it came off fantastically. You don't know though. And again, I try to avoid the things that I hate as a player, and I try to avoid the things that I take agency from the players. I will say this though, I have definitely, although this is a player facing game that asks me to do no rolling, I haven't rolled dice ever in Symbaroum in any way. They roll whatever I need rolled. I will say, I certainly, and some of this can be just my background growing up playing D&D the way I played it, and the way I'm running White Box for the local group. Traditionally, I found myself describing much on their behalf, not their feelings, not their actions, but providing sight, sense, smell, hearing. That's what you're supposed to do as a DM. You're supposed to give them the senses, right? The 6 senses. And you're supposed to describe what's happening around them. But again, I found myself at times describing how their sword strokes it is so habitual for me to describe as we're rolling from one narrative moment to a next. It's for me to connect the dots between, say, Malleus's sword strike upon the dog or upon the Jackar, and the fact that it did no damage. I felt I have to describe how it does no damage. So I have to take a little bit of that narrative from them to describe how, yes, you strike it. But because of how you can just tell your blades didn't cut through its fur or its armor or whatever. And I found myself in a way describing more of what I would like the players to do. And to be honest, I'm not certain I'm not certain that that kind of, yet in Dark Age of Man, it's very easy for me. And I don't know if it's because Dark Age of Man demands the players are telling the tale, not telling the tale. Telling the tale implies we're telling a story. It demands the players give us the visuals in a way, narrates everything. So in Dark Age of Man, it's so simple to adjudicate. Okay, you need to make a luck check here. If they make the luck check, whatever they wanted to do succeeds. If they fail the luck check, then I'm gonna be prompted to explain, or at least make note that okay, he failed his orient, so he's going to be headed in the wrong direction. He just won't know it. And then later it shows up in a negative way because he failed his luck check. So it's different. But in this combat, the way this combat is, because I don't roll any dice, there's no natural exchange of dice. There's an exchange of narration. There's an exchange of action. I activate the creature leaping out of the fog with its 2 attacks. But because I don't roll dice, there's not a natural flavor for me in a windowed environment where I can naturally narrate the results of that attack upon Malleus. So Malleus is rolling the dice. Malleus sees whether he's successful or not. And but I found myself kind of falling back into my habitual tradition of narrating pieces. And I don't think it hurts. I mean, I think that's how most of us have played role-playing our whole lives. And to be honest, I think it's actually more comfortable for us, not narrating their actions, not narrating what they're doing, making sense for everybody what that role looked like for me to narrate the next move of the creature, right? Or why it, and I could just say, your swords take purchase, and I make note it just didn't do any damage, but I want them to get feedback that they didn't damage it, right? Because if not, after 16 successful hits and they're going, why the hell is this thing not dead? I want to give them feedback that you can tell you just didn't cause any damage to it. So it feels very, much like I'm very often stepping on their toes, but I'm going to do it, and I think it came off fine. I think we all had a good time. So anyway, I will shut up now. Everybody out there, have a wonderful weekend and a great upcoming week, and good gaming. Love what you do. Love your hobby.